I learned over 6 years of stamped denials and scripted condolences that institutional silence bruised in a precise and methodical way because it erased you in fluorescent light and called it procedure. My name is Quinn Mitchell, former Medevac operations lead, and by the time Director Leonard Voss lifted my file at the Veterans Oversight Forum, I already knew the choreography of dismissal by heart, the softened voice, the cautious legal phrasing, the public expression of regret that never reached the decision line. The conference hall had been designed to communicate trust before anyone spoke. Polished brass insignia lined the panelled walls in perfect spacing, each one lit from above by a recessed strip of white light that made every emblem gleam with manufactured certainty. The wax tables reflected name placards and water glasses in exact symmetry. The air carried printer heat, stale coffee, and the faint mineral scent of rain tracked in from the Federal Plaza. On paper, it was a room for accountability. In practice, it was a room where hierarchy performed itself. I sat at the end of the second table where non-voting petitioners were placed. My name card had been misspelled, one letter shifted, the kind of small clerical error that could be dismissed as an accident and still function as a message. The stenographer didn't look up when she tested her machine. Agency counsel leaned toward each other in dark suits, exchanging low comments over binders tabbed in color-coded layers. Eligibility, exposure, command history, exceptions. I had read those same words in 6 years of rejection letters. Their order never changed. Their meaning always did. Voss waited until the room settled, until the side conversations faded, until the panel chair gave him the floor with a deferential tilt of the head. Then he tapped my file once against the microphone grill, a dry, papery click amplified through the room. Ms. Mitchell confuses field participation with qualifying command exposure, he said. Real operators know the difference. The line landed exactly as intended, not as an outburst, but as credential policing presented as technical clarification. A few people nodded almost on reflex, the way professionals nod when someone in authority offers a framework they recognize. I watched those nods travel down the table like a transmitted instruction. No one needed to insult me directly. The room had already absorbed the cue. I kept both hands flat on the wax surface and counted my breath in 4s because my body still remembered helicopter vibration and triage alarms even when my face remained still. Voss had spent years trying to provoke me into a different kind of record. He had enough memoranda on claimant affect instability from other files to know the language. If I raised my voice, if I broke posture, if I gave him one visible fracture in composure, he could attach it to a competency concern and close the loop again. In this building, reaction was evidence, and evidence was often interpreted by men who had never held a casualty list in their gloved hands. I said nothing. Silence was a decision, not surrender. The chair, a former deputy undersecretary whose biography mentioned leadership in 3 administrations and no operational background, adjusted her glasses and asked Voss to proceed with the chronology of deficiencies. He moved through my case as if reciting weather data. Missing document, unresolved category, inconsistent command index, non-qualifying designation. Every phrase carried bureaucratic neutrality, and every phrase depended on a record architecture his office controlled. My service was not being weighed. It was being translated until it no longer looked like itself. 6 years earlier, the first denial had arrived in a white envelope with a machine-sealed edge and a courteous opening line. Thank you for your service. The phrase sat above a paragraph stating that my claim did not meet the threshold criteria for benefits under revised command exposure guidelines. I had read it in my kitchen at 0610 before heading to a follow-up exam for nerve damage in my left shoulder, and I remember the exact angle of morning light across the counter because the rest of the letter blurred as soon as I reached insufficient qualifying authority documentation. I had filed supplemental logs within 10 days. They requested witness affidavits. I sent those. They requested route authorizations. I sent those too. A month later, they asked for duplicate forms already acknowledged as received. By the second week of November that year, I had started scanning every submission in triplicate, saving each receipt with timestamp metadata and delivery confirmation in a locked drive folder named Record. I did it because the process taught me quickly that memory did not count, effort did not count, pain did not count. Only artifacts counted, and even artifacts could be reclassified if the wrong office held the key. In the forum hall, Voss turned one page, then another, projecting calm mastery. "The claimant's participation in evacuation corridors is not in dispute," he said, as if granting me a ceremonial courtesy. "What remains unsubstantiated is command authority during those operations." I looked at him and thought of winter rotor wash over frozen tarmac, of headset static cracking against my ear while I made reroute calls with fuel windows collapsing minute by minute. I thought of 19-hour shifts when we ran medevac chains under weather degradation and intermittent comms, when command was not a rank patch for photographs, but a sequence of decisions with people attached. We did not discuss identity in those moments. We discussed bleed rates, flight ceilings, and whether a second run would kill a crew. Yet, in this room, those decisions were treated as if they had happened in my imagination. The panel's legal advisor asked if I wanted to respond at that stage. The invitation was formal, and it was also a trap built from timing. Early response in a hostile frame lets the initial language define you. I had learned that during Year 3 at a review where I tried to clarify mission structure and spent 20 minutes being redirected into procedural minutiae until the transcript made me sound evasive. "I'll reserve comment until all statements are entered," I said. He nodded, faintly disappointed, and marked something in the margin of his packet. Across the aisle, 2 junior analysts I did not recognize whispered over my file number. One of them glanced at me and then away, the way people look at a disputed object rather than a person in the room. They were not cruel. They were trained to inherit conclusions without touching the source. That was how institutions protected themselves from moral friction. One office categorized, another office cited, and a third office enforced the citation as neutral process. 3 years earlier, when I was still naive enough to believe thoroughness guaranteed fairness, I attended an independent review hearing chaired by a retired administrator selected by Voss's office. Independent meant he had no current employment contract with the agency. It did not mean he arrived without shared assumptions. He greeted me politely, thanked me for service, and then spent 2 hours asking whether stress had affected my recollection of operational roles. I gave dates, crew rosters, and comms references. He requested additional corroboration. I provided it. His recommendation memo concluded that while my account was sincere, documentary inconsistencies prevented favourable determination. Those inconsistencies traced back to code edits issued under Voss's signature block. At the table, I noticed a woman in the observer gallery. Grey hair pinned low, navy coat folded neatly over her lap, hands resting on a canvas record satchel worn soft at the corners. She watched the proceedings with the stillness of someone who knew how clerical systems were built from the inside. Our eyes met for a second. She gave no expression, no gesture, then looked down and opened a notepad. I did not know her name. I remembered her face anyway. Voss continued, "Ms. Mitchell's account appears emotionally invested but technically broad. We do not adjudicate sentiment, we adjudicate qualifying command." There it was again, the narrowing. Not liar, not fraud, nothing actionable. Just broad, emotional, non-technical, language that sounded clinical and carried the old accusation women in operations learned to recognize early. You felt too much to count. I pressed my thumb to the edge of my name placard until the cardstock bent. Not enough to show, just enough to feel resistance. No one from my old chain of command had been called that evening despite my request. 2 had submitted written statements. One had withdrawn after a private advisory call he later described with formal vagueness. My counsel recommended I avoid involvement in contested agency matters. I did not blame him. Careers had velocity. Few people risked trajectory for a file marked problematic. I had watched colleagues become careful around me over the years, reducing contact to holiday messages and neutral check-ins that never mentioned the claim. Contention was contagious in bureaucratic culture. Association carried cost. The panel chair asked whether there were any final procedural notes before adjournment to closed review. Voss stacked his papers with deliberate precision and said, "Only that the office remains committed to fairness and statutory integrity." Fairness. Integrity. I had seen those words on every denial. The rain outside intensified, soft percussion against the tall windows behind the gallery. Someone near the back shifted a chair leg across stone tile, a short scraping sound that cut through the HVAC hum. The stenographer stopped typing and flexed her fingers. The room had reached that threshold where decisions were nearly made, where the official narrative hardens and everyone senses it without saying it. I requested 30 seconds for a personal statement to be entered before deliberation. The chair hesitated, then granted it with visible reluctance. I stood, not to perform indignation, but to place my voice at the same height as the men who had narrated me for 6 years. I understand this forum is procedural, I said. I understand standards matter. I am not asking for deference, and I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking for source record analysis under neutral custody. My file contains mission data, transfer logs, and medical board findings that establish operational authority under active conditions. If this panel denies again, deny it on verified facts, not category drift. The room listened differently for the first time that night, not warmly but attentively, because specificity altered the temperature more than emotion ever could. I sat before anyone could reframe the statement into argument. Voss did not look at me. He looked at the chair and offered a small administrative smile, the expression of a man confident the machinery still answered to him. That was the moment I understood my appeal had never been only about compensation. It was about whether a woman could remain disciplined under ceremonial disrespect and still force the record to tell the truth. Silence was never weakness in me. It was a controlled instrument. I had carried it through 6 years of fluorescent rooms, stamped envelopes, and curated doubt, and I carried it out of that hall knowing the file was no longer the only thing under review. The chair had not even lifted her gavel hand when a communications aide in a charcoal suit stepped to the side podium and announced that, due to heightened public interest, the forum would permit a brief on-record clarification period before closed review. It sounded neutral. It was not. It meant the room would stay full, cameras from the internal feed would remain active, and Director Voss would get one more stage while I sat in petitioner seating under the same brass emblems that had already framed me as a technical misunderstanding. The overhead lights seemed colder after my statement, as if the building itself preferred fluorescent certainty to disputed testimony. Voss stood without hurry, buttoned his jacket, and accepted the podium as though he were receiving a commendation. "For process integrity," he said, scanning the room rather than looking at me, "I need to distinguish verifiable command exposure from claimant narrative inflation. Ms. Mitchell's remarks reflect conviction, not qualifying authority." He let the sentence settle, then added, "Conviction is not evidence." A few observers murmured assent. One of the junior analysts at the aisle table gave a brief, almost embarrassed smile to his colleague, the private expression of people relieved the hierarchy had reasserted itself. I felt the old electrical surge in my chest, that rising pressure between sternum and throat that used to come right before I challenged a faulty brief in command meetings, and for a thin second my hands wanted motion, wanted the microphone, wanted to break his language line by line in front of everyone. Then I saw what he was doing with perfect clarity. He was not defending policy. He was shaping the transcript. If I interrupted, I would become a behavioural footnote attached to the denial memo by morning. So I kept both palms on the table edge, shoulder width apart, and measured one controlled inhale through the nose, one controlled exhale through parted teeth, a pattern I had used in rotor noise when panic would have cost someone a landing window. A veterans liaison from the back row asked whether my claim had been thoroughly and independently reviewed. Voss answered with that careful cadence men like him used when they wanted to sound both patient and final. 6 cycles, he said. Multiple external consults. Repeated opportunities for supplementation. At some point, institutional compassion must coexist with evidentiary discipline. There was the quote he wanted in circulation. Institutional compassion. It recast 6 years of obstruction as generosity. It cast me as a woman unable to accept objective limits. The liaison turned toward me for half a second, not hostile, simply uncertain, and uncertainty in a public forum always favoured the official voice holding the binder. Agency counsel then leaned into her microphone and said petitioners were reminded not to contact panel members during recess, directly or through informal channels, while her gaze hovered over my seat just long enough to make the target unmistakable. 2 rows behind me, someone whispered, "That's standard," but standard was never deployed evenly. I had watched men challenge panels in louder tones and leave with handshakes. My warning came preemptive, public, and documented. The stenographer resumed typing. Every key strike sounded like a nail tapped into a narrow box. I turned my head toward the tall windows where rain ran in vertical ribbons over the glass and told myself the same thing I had told myself in triage corridors when I needed my hand steady. Do not spend force where force cannot alter outcome. Keep it for the decisive point. The aide called the recess, chairs scraped, and conversations rose in tidy professional clusters that excluded me without requiring anyone to say so. Within 10 minutes, the room had reorganized into circles of authority so clean they might have been drawn in chalk. Panel members moved to the side alcove with counsel. Analysts formed a knot near the projection console. Petitioners were directed toward the rear coffee station behind a velvet stanchion that had not been there earlier. I stood, gathered my legal pad, and took one step toward the records table to request a copy of the clarification transcript. A compliance officer intercepted me with a polite half-bow and said, "Ms. Mitchell, credentialed personnel only in this zone during active review transitions." Credentialed. I had worn flight credentials in weather that grounded people who now questioned whether I had held responsibility at all. I showed him my forum badge. He did not glance at it. "Different credential class," he said, then angled his body so the denial looked procedural rather than personal. Across the aisle, Voss was speaking to two regional directors, and although I could not hear every word, I heard enough. "Emotionally invested, but technically peripheral," he said, repeating the phrase like a tested line. "We see this pattern in contested files." One director asked if there was reputational exposure. Voss gave a dry smile. "Only if process discipline collapses." He finally looked at me then, brief and deliberate, and added in a voice pitched to carry, "Ms. Mitchell, no one is questioning your sincerity." Sincerity was the diminutive offered to women when competence threatened the script. It translated to, "You mean well. Adults will handle the record." Heat climbed the back of my neck. I could have walked across that waxed floor and recited mission identifiers from memory until half the room understood exactly who had held authority when comms failed. Instead, I capped my pen, nodded once, and stepped back behind the stanchion. Containment was not passivity. It was sequencing. The public address system chimed, and the forum coordinator announced that, prior to closed review, a preliminary operational matrix would be displayed for context alignment. The projection screen descended with a soft mechanical whir. Columns appeared: date, corridor designation, casualty count, command authorization code, post-mission medical annotation. It was my operational timeline stripped of my name. Where the lead authority field should have listed Quinn Mitchell, it showed Contract Liaison Unit 7C, a procurement alias I had flagged in Year 4 and been told was outside benefit relevance. My chest tightened hard enough that I pressed my thumb into the edge of my notebook to keep from speaking out of turn. A junior analyst at the console traced one row with a laser pointer and said to no one in particular, "This is why we rely on coded architecture, not personal recollection." The sentence drew quiet agreement from 3 people who had never ridden those routes. I heard another analyst ask whether the claimant had ever held direct signatory power. Voss answered without checking the source documents. "Not in qualifying capacity." The words travelled through the room like stamped ink. That was the humiliation at its most refined. Not shouted, not theatrical, just the public subtraction of identity from labour, executed in technical language while your body remained in the room to witness its own erasure. My jaw locked. My pulse was loud enough to blur the first half of the next announcement. I tasted stale coffee and metal from the HVAC and remembered with unnerving clarity the weight of a headset during a night extraction when I had signed reroute authority because waiting for higher confirmation would have cost 2 lives. I had not asked permission then to carry command burden. I had carried it because there was no one else in the seat. Now men in tailored suits spoke as if command were a ceremonial title denied to me by grammar. The coordinator invited brief factual corrections from credentialed staff before the panel withdrew. I was not recognised in that category. I stood anyway and waited until the chair noticed me. She looked to counsel. Counsel looked to Voss. He gave the smallest shrug, the kind that implied indulgence toward a persistent inconvenience. 30 seconds, the chair said, her tone clipped by impatience. Every face turned, some curious, some guarded, some already dismissive. My heartbeat had steadied into operational rhythm. I did not raise my voice. For accuracy, I said, the matrix displayed includes sorties flown under alias Code 7C during procurement shielding years. Those entries correspond to medevac chains authorized in active degradation windows. Source verification requires cross-reference with maintenance token logs and casualty manifests held in archive division, not summary codes alone. I stopped there. No adjectives, no accusation, just sequence. Voss answered before the chair could. Ms. Mitchell is reiterating a theory previously reviewed and found non-determinative. Theory. Another diminishing word. Laughter did not break out. This room was too disciplined for that. But several people exhaled through their noses in a synchronized way that signaled the same conclusion. Issue contained. The chair thanked me without eye contact and instructed the panel to recess to close deliberation. Security opened the side door. Officials moved as a group, and I was left on the petitioner side with my notebook, my bent name placard, and a screen full of my work assigned to an alias unit that had never loaded a patient in freezing crosswind. 3 days earlier, I would have called that moment proof the system could not be moved. Standing there, I recognized something narrower and more useful. They had now committed the subtraction to a live forum record in front of witnesses. Humiliation, once documented, could become evidence of method. I gathered my papers slowly because haste reads as agitation on cameras and walked toward the rear corridor marked Waiting Area B while the last of the panel disappeared behind frosted glass. The hallway smelled of floor polish and damp wool coats. Fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead in uneven intervals. At the check-in desk, the grey-haired woman from the gallery was arguing with a records clerk in a voice too low to attract security. I caught only fragments: retention schedule, misfiled under contractor index. You cannot purge during active dispute. She saw me, ended the exchange, and approached with the careful posture of someone who had spent a career protecting paper from people with titles. Ms. Mitchell, she said, and for the first time that night my name was pronounced correctly. Do not leave before they reopen. She slid a folded routing slip across my notebook as if returning dropped property. On the outside she had written one line in block print: Request archive crosswalk for Unit 7, C under neutral custody. Then she moved away before I could ask her anything, leaving me in the corridor with the slip under my palm, the closed deliberation door at my left, and the same decision point I'd faced for 6 years: spend myself in visible anger, or hold the line long enough for the record to corner the people who thought they controlled it. I chose the line. I stayed in the moulded plastic chair outside Waiting Area B with the routing slip under my palm until the heat of my skin softened the paper and blurred the pressure marks from her pen. The corridor clock clicked in sterile half-seconds above a bulletin board of compliance notices no one read. A vending machine hummed beside a locked fire door, fluorescent light flattening every colour into government beige. Through the frosted deliberation glass, I could see moving silhouettes and the intermittent lift of hands, a room still translating my life into categories. The old surge of anger was there, but it was narrow now, disciplined into attention. If they reopened the forum and asked for source analysis, I needed sequence, dates, chain custody, and one clean bridge between alias code and operational authority. That work had begun years before this hallway, long before Voss learned to say my name as if it were a clerical burden. In the second year of appeals, after denial cycle 3, I sat in a regional adjudication office where the carpet smelled faintly of mildew, and the intake clerk kept apologising for a printer jam while my shoulder spasmed under my blazer. The hearing officer had thanked me for my patience, thanked me for my service, and then asked whether my perception of command might have been shaped by crisis stress. He asked it in a careful voice that implied concern, while relocating credibility from me to his questionnaire. I answered with mission logs, route authorizations, and medboard references. He nodded, wrote nothing, and requested objective supplementation. When I brought objective supplementation, his office replied that the materials arrived outside optimal review window. By late January of that year, I had started carrying a hard case with labelled dividers to every appointment: submission receipts, courier confirmations, witness affidavits, treatment records, maintenance cross-references, and each rejection letter arranged by date and rationale. The pattern was so consistent it no longer needed interpretation. If I submitted sworn witness statements, they requested machine logs. If I submitted machine logs, they requested independent witness verification. If I submitted both, they questioned authority thresholds and redirected me to revised criteria published after the missions at issue. Every step looked defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a closed loop with my file in the center, moving, never resolving. In year 3, a compliance liaison named Brent called me at 0704 and told me, with institutional gentleness, that my case had been selected for expedited reconciliation. I remember the time because I was icing my left shoulder before physical therapy, and the call came just as the coffee maker shut off. He said his unit wanted to clear ambiguities. 2 weeks later, I sat in a glass conference room with 6 people who introduced themselves by function, not by decision authority: risk, legal, coding, external affairs, quality assurance, regional coordination. They discussed my missions in acronyms while I watched my own timelines on a shared screen. At one point, I corrected a corridor designation and identified the weather degradation window from memory. A legal analyst smiled without looking up and said, "We'll let credentialed coders handle field architecture." The room kept moving. I was present, but only as narrative source material. That meeting ended with a promise of written findings in 10 business days. 26 days later, I received a letter with my address block slightly misaligned and the same conclusion in new language: non-qualifying command exposure. The signature line belonged to an acting deputy who had not attended the meeting. Attached was a summary sheet that misstated one mission date and omitted 2 casualty transfers from the final run. I filed correction exhibits, including time-stamped extracts and radio relay transcripts. The response thanked me and advised that newly received data had been integrated into ongoing quality calibration, then closed the file pending future review cycle. Integration meant absorption without correction. Calibration meant delay. What wore me down was never a single insult. It was repetition with a polite face. In year 4, a medical re-evaluation panel spent 40 minutes on pain range and 6 minutes on operational consequence, then sent a memo to adjudication recommending further verification of role centrality. In year 5, one of my former colleagues agreed to provide testimony, called me the night before submission deadline, and withdrew after what he described as a career risk advisory. He did not lie to me. He sounded ashamed and tired, and his apology came in a formal cadence people use when they need distance from their own fear. I told him I understood. I did understand. Institutions rarely need to threaten directly when everyone can already calculate the cost. The deepest cut came in cycle 6, at a regional oversight hearing where Voss attended remotely on a wall screen and referred to me as the claimant for 42 minutes. Not once did he use my rank. Not once did he say operations lead. When I cited 2 directives that established field authority in degraded communications environments, he said those directives were contextual, not dispositive, and asked the chair to note my continued reliance on anecdotal command framing. Anecdotal. As if triage orders, fuel decisions, and reroute approvals were campfire stories I told myself to feel important. I left that hearing with a printed denial and sat in my car while rain tracked down the windshield in thin silver lines, unable to turn the key for several minutes because my hands were shaking too hard to hold still. 3 days passed after that before I could reopen the binder without nausea. On the 4th day, I reread every denial from year 1 forward and highlighted recurring terms in blue: non-qualifying, inconsistent, supplementary, contextual, unresolved. Then I highlighted every phrase that acknowledged my field participation in green. Not disputed, recognized, appreciated, noted. The document was admitting labour while denying authority, praising service while voiding status. That contradiction was not accidental drift. It was architecture. Voss had found a way to preserve institutional gratitude as public language and institutional exclusion as operative result. In the present corridor, the deliberation door remained closed. A janitorial cart rolled past, lemon disinfectant, briefly overtaking the metallic HVAC smell. I unfolded the routing slip again and studied the line she had written. Request archive crosswalk for Unit 7C under neutral custody. Neutral custody was the hinge. Every prior review had relied on records assembled by the same adjudication chain that benefited from my disqualification. If archive crosswalk data moved under independent control, the alias map could be tested against origin logs instead of summary tables. I took out my pen and wrote 2 names below her line. Archive Division Intake Supervisor, Maribel Knox, and Records Integrity Ombuds Office Extension 4471. I had called both offices twice in the past year and been routed back to adjudication queue. Today, with live forum proceedings on record, denial might leave its own trace. I walked to the wall phone by the elevators because mobile signal in the corridor was inconsistent and used my petitioner badge code to access internal extension dialing. Knox's office voicemail answered with a scripted notice about high call volume and delayed responses. I left my name, file number, forum docket, and a precise request for immediate archive crosswalk preservation under active dispute protocol. Then I called the Ombuds extension. A clerk answered, voice clipped and alert. I stated, "This is Quinn Mitchell, petitioner in Active Oversight Forum Review, requesting neutral custody hold on Archive Unit 7C crosswalk records pending deliberation." She asked whether there was an existing preservation order. I said no, then read the forum docket and the timestamp from the public clarification period. Keys clicked on her end. "Request logged," she said. "Reference code RI-29-11-C. We do not adjudicate merits, we log chain of custody triggers." It was not validation. It was better than silence. When I turned back toward waiting area B, the grey-haired woman was standing near the water dispenser with her canvas satchel open on a narrow bench. Up close, she looked older than I first guessed, the fine skin at her temples mapped with pale lines, posture straight despite a slight tremor in her left hand. Her badge, turned inward on its clip, showed only the last name, Delaney. She waited until a passing analyst disappeared around the corner before speaking. "You made the Ombuds call," she said. "I logged preservation," I answered. "If this is a mistake, tell me now." "It is late, not mistaken." Her voice carried the dry precision of someone who had spent decades inside records rooms where language was currency. I retired from Combat Documentation Registry 4 years ago. I processed maintenance tokens, manifest reconciliations, and contractor shielding indexes during the procurement investigations. Your file kept resurfacing with fragments removed from context. I filed 2 internal discrepancy notes. Both were redirected. Redirected where? Adjudication policy review, which means buried in interpretation. She held my gaze for a moment, weighing whether I understood the risk she was taking by standing there. "You are not the only one with missing authority fields. You are the only one whose pattern stayed consistent across 6 cycles." From her satchel, she removed a thin, sealed envelope marked Internal Audit Index, restricted transfer, and placed it on the bench between us without pushing it toward me. Then she reached into an inner pocket and set down a small metal token inside a clear evidence sleeve. Even through the plastic, I recognized the engraving Raven 6, my call sign from the winter corridor rotations, etched above a serial string and a maintenance stamp date I had not seen in years. The token was dull at the edges, scuffed from handling, the kind of object technicians clip to flight packet chains to authenticate vehicle and crew linkage when digital systems were unstable. My throat tightened, not from surprise but from the sharp return of procedural memory. That token system had been temporary, introduced during a software vulnerability period, then phased out quietly. We were told the logs would be folded into central architecture. Instead, somewhere along the chain, my missions were folded into Unit 7C and my authority line was stripped. Delaney tapped the sealed envelope once. The index maps alias codes to source records and signatory lanes. Not full files, just the key. I copied this before retirement when the purge schedule changed. I should have moved sooner. "You're handing this to a claimant in a federal building," I said. "That can be framed as tampering. That is why you will not open it here. You will submit it at the record desk when the forum reopens and request receipt under neutral custody with dual witness signatures. Say those words exactly." She slid a second paper across the bench, handwritten chain instructions in block letters. "And this token goes with it, sealed. Do not break that sleeve." I looked at the token again. Raven 6. A symbol no one in that deliberation room had expected to surface because they assumed the architecture could stay abstract forever. I asked the question that mattered. "Why help now?" Delaney's expression did not soften. "Because people like Voss survive by converting lived command into administrative haze. because I watched good records get relabeled until careers and care both disappeared. Because if the audit starts without a key, they will call your evidence incomplete and proceed anyway. The intercom chimed overhead, abrupt and flat. Forum participants in docket Phi OF117C. Closed review has concluded. Parties return to main chamber immediately. The corridor changed pace at once. Doors opening, shoes striking tile, low voices tightening into official tone. Delaney picked up her satchel and stepped back from the bench. "You did not receive this in private conversation," she said. "You received it during active procedural transfer." I nodded once. "Under witness line." She gave the smallest incline of her head, acknowledgement rather than reassurance. "Hold your sequence. Do not let them name the frame before the documents are logged." I took the sealed envelope and the sleeved token with both hands, not because they were fragile, but because they were finally exact. For 6 years, I had been told my record lacked qualifying authority. Now qualifying authority sat in my palms as metal and paper, with chain of custody language written in block print and a retired clerk willing to stand where cameras could see her if they chose. As we moved toward the chamber doors, I felt the familiar pressure in my chest settle into operational rhythm. They had taught me through repetition that dignity without proof could be ignored. Today, I carried proof designed to survive their language. We reached the chamber doors with the rest of the docket participants, but the room received us as if we were entering different buildings. Panel members were waved through the inner lane by security with a nod and a palm gesture. Agency counsel crossed without pausing. Analysts took their seats at the front console. I was stopped at the outer rope while the guard examined my badge twice, then held out his hand for the envelope and token sleeve before I could speak. I kept both items against my chest and said, in the calmest voice I could hold, "These are pending evidentiary materials for on-record submission under neutral custody with dual witness signatures." He did not answer me directly. He looked toward the records desk, where a clerk in a green lanyard was already shaking her head. "Late submissions are typically deferred to subsequent cycle," she called across the aisle, her tone pitched to sound informative rather than dismissive. "Typically," I said. "Not categorically. Docket Vi OF-117C remains open until adjournment." Voss had just taken his seat beside counsel, and he turned at the sound of my voice with a patient expression I'd come to recognise as operational theatre. "Madam Chair," he said, before the chair had even settled her papers, "the claimant appears to be introducing unscreened material after closed review. For integrity, we should decline and proceed." The chair did not look at me. She looked at him. "Counsel?" Agency counsel leaned toward her microphone. "The forum may accept materials if chain custody is established and parties are permitted inspection. We would object to immediate substantive reliance. Object to reliance. Accept and neutralize." It was the same strategy in tighter language. I stepped forward one pace, enough for the stenographer to catch the line without being asked. "I am requesting logging, not immediate reliance, neutral custody, dual witness signatures. I am also requesting attachment of Records Integrity Reference Code RI-29-11-C to this submission." That got 3 heads up at once. Counsel, the compliance officer near the side wall, and one of the junior analysts who had been whispering earlier. The chair finally faced me, irritation visible at the corners of her mouth. "Ms. Mitchell, you will not direct procedure." "I am not directing procedure," I said. "I am preserving record integrity." The room held a beat of silence that felt engineered, long enough for me to hear the faint buzz from the projector ballast and the soft hiss of rain against the high windows. Then the chair nodded toward the records desk. "Conditional intake. Marcus disputed, pending verification." I passed the envelope and token sleeve to the clerk with my fingers flat so no one could later claim I had manipulated seals. Delaney stepped out from the rear gallery before anyone called her and said, "I can witness transfer." Her voice carried to the panel with clean authority, neither loud nor apologetic. Voss turned in his chair, brows lifting. "And you are?" "Eleanor Delaney, retired Combat Documentation Registry, Records Processing Specialist, Serial 44-C-91. He gave a brief smile that did not reach his eyes. "Retired. Not currently credentialed for adjudication." "No longer adjudicating," she said, still competent to witness a seal. The chair hesitated again, and I watched the social hierarchy reassemble itself in real time around that single pause. A retired clerk with a canvas satchel did not fit the room's preferred witness profile. She had no command ribbon to dazzle the audience, no legal rank, no current title that could be quoted in a press note. She had procedure, memory, and a willingness to stand where people in power could see her. In rooms like this, that was often treated as impertinence. The clerk at the desk looked uncomfortable. "I need a second witness from active staff." "I'll witness," said the compliance officer who had blocked me at recess. He did not look at me as he signed. He did not need to. His signature and Delaney's were now beneath the intake line. The clerk stamped the receipt, then paused over the name field. "Claimant Quinn." "Mitchell," I said. She corrected it without apology and slid the carbon copy toward me. The red stamp bled slightly through the paper. "Received under dispute custody, 1942. I folded it once and placed it inside my notebook. Pressure rose immediately after that, not by overt confrontation, but by structured diminishment. My microphone light remained off while other participants tested theirs. My seat card had been moved one place farther from the center table. When the projection returned, the operational matrix appeared again with Unit 7C still occupying the lead authority field, and this time a disclaimer banner ran across the bottom. "Claimant materials pending authentication. No weight assigned." One of the analysts asked to keep comments to credentialed interpreters to prevent narrative contamination, and nobody corrected the phrasing. The chair announced that petitioner remarks would be limited to 90 seconds at close of technical discussion to maintain order. Maintain order had become the room's way of saying, "Stay small." By the time the wall clock reached 1950, the temperature in the chamber had dropped enough that I could feel the cold through the sleeves of my blazer. Voss stood and began an updated summary as if the intake had been a minor inconvenience. "The office acknowledges a late transfer object and a purported index copy from non-current personnel," he said. "Until forensic validation, these items remain unverified artifacts. The adjudication basis remains unchanged." He did not touch the envelope. He did not mention the call sign on the token. He spoke around both, converting concrete objects into rhetorical haze. Then he gestured toward the screen where my mission sat under the contractor alias and added, "The claimant continues to conflate proximity to operations with qualifying command authority. We respect service narratives. We cannot substitute them for statutory thresholds." A few people nodded again. The same nods from earlier transmitted down the table as if agreement were an administrative reflex. I felt the old burn behind my ribs, the instinct to break in and dismantle each clause on contact. Instead, I wrote 3 words on my legal pad in block letters: sequence before outrage. The panel moved into rapid technical exchange. Counsel asked whether archive crosswalk requests had ever been formally denied. A risk officer answered that no complete crosswalk had been necessary to disposition. An analyst argued that alias use during procurement shielding could not itself establish command entitlement. Another asked whether mission manifests had independent medical coding corroboration. I knew the answer to each question from years of chasing file fragments, but my mic stayed dark while they debated my history as abstraction. At 1958, a clerk entered from the side door and handed a folded note to the chair. She read it, frowned, and passed it to counsel. Counsel's posture changed by a degree, shoulders tightening. She pressed her earpiece, listened, then said into the microphone, "For the record, Records Integrity has logged a chain of custody trigger under reference RI-29-11-C associated with this docket. Accordingly, no transferred materials may be returned, altered, or excluded from audit routing pending review." The shift in the room was subtle but immediate. Voss stopped turning his pen. The junior analysts looked at each other, then down at their screens. The compliance officer near the wall straightened as if he had just remembered he was visible. Voss recovered first. "Logged trigger does not modify adjudicative standards," he said. Counsel answered without warmth. "It modifies handling constraints." He sat back, jaw set, and for the first time that night his certainty had edges. The chair cleared her throat. "Given the trigger, this forum will request an audit integrity observer before final recommendation language is drafted." "Unnecessary," Voss said. "We have sufficient internal controls." "Requested," she repeated, and struck the gavel once. That should have been a procedural footnote. In that building, it landed like a pressure seam opening. 7 minutes later, the side doors opened again. 2 uniformed aides entered first, followed by a woman in a dark service dress coat with silver insignia at the collar and the restrained carriage of someone accustomed to rooms changing when she crossed a threshold. Admiral Helena Ward did not hurry. She moved to the designated witness table, set down a slim portfolio, and acknowledged the chair with a formal incline of her head. The chamber stood. Even Voss. By the first week of December, I had learned to read status not by titles printed on placards, but by the silence that followed a person into the room. Ward carried that kind of silence, not theatrical, not performative, just exact. She sat when directed, accepted the oath and said, "Inspector General Liaison for Audit Integrity. Assigned temporary oversight on docket Phi OF 117C following records integrity escalation." Voss attempted to seize the frame before she could establish her own. "Admiral, welcome. You should know this is a long-running claimant dissatisfaction matter with extensive prior review." Ward turned her head toward him, expression neutral. "I reviewed your summary memo in the corridor. I am not here for claimant satisfaction. I am here for source data fidelity." The stenographer's hands moved faster. Counsel asked whether Ward required immediate recess to review transferred materials. "No," Ward said. "I require chain confirmation and preliminary identification now." The clerk brought the sealed envelope and token sleeve to her table under camera view. Ward inspected the evidence tape, confirmed intake time, then held the token at an angle beneath the task light. The engraving caught for an instant. Raven 6. I watched her eyes narrow a fraction, not in confusion but in recognition of system context. "Who submitted this?" she asked. I stood. "Quinn Mitchell, petitioner." "Who witnessed transfer?" Delaney stood behind me in the gallery lane. "Eleanor Delaney, retired combat documentation registry with compliance officer co-signature." Ward looked from Delaney to the compliance officer, who nodded once and stated his name for the record. Then Ward asked the question no one else in 6 years had asked in open session. "Director Voss, did your office adjudicate missions tagged to contractor alias Unit 7C without obtaining archive crosswalk from origin logs?" He did not answer immediately. "We adjudicated based on validated summaries available at the time." "That is not my question." A thin line of colour rose along his neck. "Crosswalk retrieval was assessed as non-essential to threshold determination." Ward placed the token back on the table with controlled precision. "Non-essential to whom?" No one spoke. She turned to the clerk. "Open the envelope on camera." The seal split with a dry tear that sounded louder than it should have in that room. Inside was the internal audit index Delaney had preserved, pages stamped with legacy registry marks and cross-reference codes linking alias unit entries to mission identifiers, signatory lanes, and operational lead fields. Ward scanned the first page, then the second, then stopped at a column and traced one line with her pen tip. When she spoke again, her voice remained measured, but the room's centre of gravity had shifted to her entirely. "Preliminary review indicates Unit 7C entries map to active medevac missions with lead authority assigned to Lieutenant Commander Quinn Mitchell." She looked up, first at the chair, then at Voss. "This forum will suspend any recommendation language that omits that possibility. Immediate source reconciliation is now mandatory." The chair nodded, suddenly deferential in a way she had not been with me all evening. "Understood." Voss leaned toward his microphone. "With respect, Admiral, preliminary mapping is not dispositive of benefit eligibility." Ward held his gaze. "With respect, Director, omission of mapped authority during adjudication is dispositive of audit concern." The words settled over polished wood, brass insignia, glass water pitchers, and every person who had watched me be reduced to a narrative inconvenience. No one nodded this time. No one whispered. The analysts sat still with their hands above their keyboards, waiting for instruction that no longer came from the same side of the table. I remained standing because my knees had not yet decided whether they were steady. Across the aisle, Delaney lowered herself back into her seat, hands folded over the worn canvas satchel, face unreadable. Ward returned to the index, turning pages with deliberate care, while counsel requested immediate retrieval of archive origin logs, and the chair announced a controlled extension of session under audit supervision. Social pressure had not vanished. It had changed owners. The exclusion I had carried for 6 years was now visible as method, and method had met rank, procedure, and a witness who understood both. I did not speak again in that minute. I did not need to. My name was finally in the record in the same tense as authority, and the room had heard it from someone they could not patronize. Ward did not raise her voice, and that restraint gave the sentence its full weight. She set the index flat, aligned its edge with the table seam, and addressed the chair in the same tone she might have used to correct a navigation heading. Madam Chair, enter the following directive. Provisional identity restoration on all displayed mission matrices, pending full archive reconciliation. Effective immediately, remove contractor alias Unit 7C as primary lead indicator where this index maps direct operational authority. Annotate each affected line with Lieutenant Commander Quinn Mitchell, status contested no longer on identity but on downstream entitlement calculations. She paused, then added, Identity suppression is not a neutral clerical event. It is an audit defect. The chair looked to counsel for cover, found none, and nodded to the projection team. Do it now. The junior analyst at the console froze with his fingers over the keyboard. He had spent the evening speaking in abstract terms about coded architecture. Now he had to alter that architecture in public view while the record captured every key stroke. He swallowed, entered credentials, and opened the authority field map. The screen refreshed once, then again. Unit 7C remained for half a second, pale grey against the blue grid. Then my name appeared on the first corrected row, black text, 12-point sans serif, unadorned and absolute. Lieutenant Commander Quinn Mitchell. No applause came. This room did not traffic in overt emotion, but the silence changed density as if everyone had stepped into colder air. Ward continued with procedural precision. Second directive, immediate hold on adverse adjudication outputs tied to this file number and all derivative memos issued under Director Voss's office pending integrity review. Third, emergency extraction of source logs from Archive Division under dual custody seal tonight, not tomorrow. Fourth, formal notice to benefits disbursement to prepare provisional reinstatement pathway contingent on source confirmation, with penalty exposure calculation for documented delay periods. Counsel cleared her throat. Admiral, reinstatement usually follows final board vote. Usually, Ward said, this case contains prima facie reclassification conflict over 6 cycles. Delay now compounds institutional liability. I felt my pulse in my wrists, steady and hard. 6 years of submissions, hearings, and controlled breathing, and the first true motion in my favour came as a list of directives spoken into a federal microphone by someone who understood both chain of command and chain of evidence. Voss leaned forward, fingertips pressed together, voice tight but still formal. For the record, I object to characterization of suppression. Classification variances occurred during procurement turbulence and were processed in good faith. Ward turned one page in the index and read the line number before responding. Good faith does not survive repeated denial after notice of discrepancy. Your office received 2 discrepancy flags from registry processing, one in year 4, one in year 5. Both were marked non-essential and routed away from source reconciliation. Do you dispute receipt? He hesitated for a fraction too long. I would need to inspect those routing artifacts. Delaney spoke from the gallery without standing. I filed both flags. I retained copies with transmission stamps. The chair struck her gavel once. Witness statements will be recognized in sequence. Her hand trembled slightly when she set the gavel down. Ward inclined her head toward Delaney, then returned to the chair. Sequence is exactly what has been missing. I recommend this forum adopt immediate corrective sequence before further commentary dilutes the record. The word dilutes landed like a warning shot in bureaucratic language. Counsel nodded toward the clerk. Draft the motion. At 2015, the stenographer requested a cartridge change, and the tiny interruption felt surreal against the scale of what was moving. While she swapped reels with practiced hands, I watched the records clerk pull a fresh template and begin typing correction language under the forum's crest. Her monitor reflected in the polished wood. Provisional Record Correction Order, VOF 117C. My misspelled name from earlier sat on the old placard by my elbow. On her screen it was right. When the stenographer resumed, Ward requested I step to the witness microphone for limited operational verification. The chair granted it. I stood, walked the narrow aisle, and felt every gaze recalculate. Not warm, not sympathetic, simply recalibrated around utility. For years I had been treated as emotionally invested, but technically peripheral. Now the room needed my sequence. "State your name and prior role for the record," counsel said. "Quinn Elise Mitchell, Lieutenant Commander, Medevac Operations Lead, Corridor Rotations Northern and Coastal Bands. Did you exercise direct operational authority on missions cross-mapped from Unit 7C in the index entered tonight?" "Yes." "Under what conditions?" "Degraded communications, contested weather windows, casualty priority compression, and time-limited fuel routing." Ward asked the next question herself. "When higher authorization was unavailable within survivability window, who held reroute authority?" "I did." "Was that authority delegated verbally, in writing, or by standing directive?" "All three, depending on mission date and comms status. Standing directive covered degradation protocols." Ward nodded once. "That aligns with extracted line notes in this index," Voss interjected. "Alignment with line notes is not equivalence with statutory command exposure." Ward answered without looking at him. "It is equivalence with identity and authority attribution, which your office contested as absent." Then she faced the chair. "Public reversal need not be theatrical. It needs to be exact. Enter this exact statement. Previous forum characterizations of claimant authority as unsubstantiated are withdrawn pending full audit because foundational identity mapping was materially incomplete." The chair repeated it slowly for the clerk, each word sounding heavier than the last. "Withdrawn pending full audit. Materially incomplete." I had imagined this moment in sleepless fragments over the years, always with some dramatic flourish I would refuse to perform when it came. The reality was narrower and cleaner, a sentence entered into record that removed the false frame. That was enough, more than enough. The clerk printed the motion. Paper slid from the tray with a soft mechanical whisper. Counsel signed first. The chair signed second. Ward signed as integrity witness. Then the document was passed to me for acknowledgement of corrected identity mapping receipt. My hand did not shake when I signed Quinn Mitchell in full, each letter clear. "Record it," Ward said. The clerk stamped the page. "Approved for immediate procedural effect." The projector refreshed again, row after row, updating as the console team applied the correction set. My name appeared 6 times, then 12, then 19 across the matrix. Casualty counts remained unchanged. Dates remained unchanged. Only authority fields shifted from alias Hayes to accountable history. The room that had treated me as procedural noise now watched my name repopulate the work I had carried. Voss requested a sidebar with counsel. The chair denied it. "On record only," she said, voice thin. He stood anyway, adjusted his jacket and tried one more line of control. "Madam Chair, if we continue under this framing, we risk prejudicing future entitlement findings." Ward replied first. Future findings were already prejudiced by 6 years of incomplete source mapping. Counsel added, "Director, sit down." He sat. That was the concise reversal. No speech, no vindictive display, no raised hand from me. A room built to erase me had entered an order restoring my operational identity and suspending the machinery that had profited from ambiguity. The humiliation line from the opening hours of the forum still existed in the transcript, but now it stood beside its contradiction, spoken by rank and documented under seal. The destabilization began quietly, almost politely, in the currency Voss had trusted his whole career: audience perception. He reached for his water glass, missed the stem, and corrected the motion with visible care. A flush climbed his neck, then drained. Under the recessed lights, his face lost colour by increments, as if each new correction row on the screen pulled one shade away. He asked for the matrix freeze, citing review clarity, but his voice caught on the word clarity and flattened into a hoarse edge he could not smooth. Across from him, the 2 regional directors who had nodded at his phrasing during recess no longer looked in his direction. One studied his legal pad as if it contained urgent mathematics. The other kept both palms flat beside her folder, eyes fixed on Ward. Social distance formed in real time, subtle and ruthless. Ward requested the discrepancy flag log. The clerk retrieved it from the side docket and passed it down. She read the headers aloud. Registry warning, routing decision, disposition code, signatory lane. Each line traced back to Voss's authority chain. He attempted to interrupt twice with procedural qualifiers. Twice the chair said, "You'll have your turn." The second time, his microphone light was still on after she cut him off, capturing an audible inhale that sounded less like composure and more like someone finding no air at the expected depth. By 2032, counsel had moved her chair 3 inches away from his, a small adjustment that in any other room would mean nothing, and in this room meant survival calculus. She began speaking in conditional phrasing that detached office liability from personal conduct. If discrepancy notices were received and not escalated, that may indicate a breakdown in adjudication workflow. Breakdown in workflow was legal language for your signature is about to stand alone. Delaney remained still in the gallery, hands folded over her satchel, but her earlier silence had already paid off. The meaningful look she gave me in part 1, the note in the corridor, the envelope under seal, each had found its place in sequence. Nothing floated now, everything connected. The compliance officer who had co-signed my intake cleared his throat and asked permission to amend his earlier recess notation, where he had recorded me as attempting late informal submission. With the record now corrected, he requested changing the phrase to formal disputed custody transfer pursuant to active forum review. The chair approved. He wrote the amendment slowly, shoulders rigid, then signed again. Voss watched that amendment happen and seemed to understand that the building itself was withdrawing its informal protections. He leaned toward his counsel and whispered. She did not whisper back. Instead, she spoke into her microphone. Given emerging integrity concerns, I recommend immediate, temporary reassignment of adjudication authority for docket-linked files away from Director Voss's unit, pending investigation. The sentence struck harder than any accusation. It was institutional exile phrased as workflow hygiene. Voss turned to her, disbelief overtaking discipline. You are recommending removal in open session. I am recommending continuity of lawful process, she said. He looked to the chair for rescue. The chair looked to Ward. Ward gave one short nod. Motion entered, the chair said. Temporary reassignment approved. For the first time all night, Voss had no line ready. His mouth opened, then closed. His throat worked once, dry. The man who had spent 6 years shaping language around me now sat in the same fluorescent light, unable to control the sentence that defined him. No one moved to soften it. No one offered him interpretive charity. The audience he depended on had shifted its gaze. The projector flashed a final update. Authority field corrections applied. 100% of flagged rows. Beneath it, in smaller text, appeared the new handling code, Emergency Audit Track/Benefits. Hold lift preparation. Counsel asked me one final operational question for that session. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell, are you prepared to provide full mission sequence to the audit team tonight? Yes. Ward closed her portfolio. Then we proceed tonight. The chair announced a controlled adjournment of public remarks and continuation under audit protocol. Still on record, no off-the-record sidebars permitted. As people gathered papers, Voss remained seated, eyes fixed on the corrected matrix as if staring long enough might restore the old version. Under the brass insignia and hard white lights, his authority did not collapse in spectacle. It collapsed in silence, annotation, and signatures. I returned to my seat, picked up the misspelled placard and turned it over. On the blank back, I wrote the reference code Delaney had helped me secure, RI-2-9-1-1-C, then tucked it inside my notebook beside the stamped order bearing my correct name. When I tucked the placard away, the forum coordinator directed essential parties to Audit Room C, a windowless operations space 2 corridors behind the main chamber where the air smelled of toner, metal vents, and overworked circuitry. The brass insignia were gone there. In their place were grey acoustic panels, a long composite table, and 2 wall screens already split into source log feeds. Ward took the head seat without ceremony. No rhetorical statements, she said. Sequence, custody, verification. Counsel repeated the instruction for the record. Voss was assigned a side position with no control over the agenda, and the demotion was visible in how people stopped turning toward him before they spoke. At 21:07, the ombuds clerk I had called from the corridor appeared on video link, identified herself as Dana Ruiz, and read the callback outcome into the transcript. Reference RI-29-11-C was logged at 1931. Preservation trigger executed at 1934. Archive deletion queues touching Unit 7C were frozen at 1936. No records were purged after trigger initiation. She looked directly at the camera when she added, "Requester identity Quinn Mitchell, logging action verified." For 6 years, phone calls had vanished into polite voicemail loops. Hearing one come back as enforceable action felt like a structural beam sliding into place. 2 minutes later, the side door opened and Maribel Knox entered with a locked transfer case and a custody envelope clipped to a blue board. She introduced herself as Archive Division Intake Supervisor, then set the case on the evidence mat while the camera zoomed. We received voicemail from Miss Mitchell before the trigger and formal hold notice after, she said. Both were attached to extraction authorization. She turned to Ward. Origin logs for alias Unit 7C, maintenance token registry extracts, and signatory lane maps are present. Chain remains intact. Knox's gloved hands were steady as she cut the tamper strip and laid out each folder in numbered order. Every physical thread that had been questioned now had a place on a labelled surface. Ward had the sleeve token brought forward again. Under magnification, the etched serial on Raven 6 matched the maintenance ledger entry from a winter corridor date I could still recite from memory. Knox read the corresponding line. Operational lead field, Mitchell, QE, Delegated Authority Lane, Active Degradation Directive. Counsel requested cross-check against casualty manifests. An analyst who had dismissed me at recess opened the manifest file, found the same mission identifier, and said quietly, "Lead authorization initials align." He didn't look at me when he said it. He did not need to. His voice was enough to mark the reversal of method. By 22:10, the second screen held a live reconciliation grid. Alias code, origin mission ID, command lane, adjudication code used in denial cycles. Red flags stacked down the fourth column where denial codes had ignored mapped authority. Ward asked Delaney to state, for final closure, what she knew and when she knew it. Delaney sat upright, hands folded over her canvas satchel as if she was still at a registry desk. "I filed discrepancy notes in Year 4 and Year 5, she said. Both warned that contractor alias mapping was being treated as identity, not shield artifact. Both were routed away from source reconciliation. She named the routing channels and the timestamps from her retained copies. The loaded look she had given me in the first forum night had always carried this exact knowledge. Now it was on record, with dates. Voss asked to respond. Ward permitted 60 seconds. He said the same words he had used all evening. Workflow pressure, good faith reliance, non-final summaries. Only now each phrase fell against documentary line items that did not bend. Counsel cut in before his minute ended. Director, for accuracy, adjudication signature authority under these cycles resolves to your office. Attempts to characterize this as diffuse workflow are not supported by the lane map. She slid a prepared form across to the chair. Temporary removal from adjudicative authority, effective immediately. The chair signed it at 22:24. Security did not escort him out dramatically. They simply asked for his badge and console credentials, and he handed both over with a hand that failed once before finding the clip. At 23:03, Ward dictated the interim order in full. Identity correction finalized, entitlement eligibility restored. Pending only arithmetic verification, benefits hold lifted, retroactive compensation window fixed at 6 years, statutory delay penalties mandated, compliance review expanded to all similarly coded files. The records clerk printed 4 originals. The internal audit index from Delaney's envelope was logged as Exhibit A and transferred to Central Evidence Vault under Knox's custody. The token was scanned at high resolution, entered as Exhibit B, then, at Ward's direction, returned to registry stewardship with a notation that I could request ceremonial release after case closure. My stamped disputed custody receipt was copied, attached to the exhibit log, and returned to me as claimant copy. Even the misspelled placard was not left hanging as a symbol without function. Counsel accepted it as a minor procedural exhibit documenting petitioner misidentification at intake and attached it to the corrective memo packet. We reconvened in the main chamber just after midnight for public issuance because Ward refused off-record closure. The same polished brass insignia looked different under the late-hour lights, less triumphant, more like metal waiting for interpretation. The chair read the order with clipped precision, and each clause landed in the room that had once nodded through my erasure. The forum finds prior denials materially compromised by incomplete and misclassified source mapping. The record is corrected. Lieutenant Commander Quinn Mitchell's operational authority is affirmed. Benefits reinstatement is effective immediately, with retroactive disbursement and penalty calculation as required by statute. She stopped, swallowed, and added, Director Leonard Voss is removed from adjudication authority pending compliance action. No one applauded. A veteran in the back row lowered his head, then looked up at me and held the gaze for a second that felt like acknowledgement rather than pity. The junior analysts remained still, hands flat beside their keyboards. One of the regional directors who had echoed Voss's framing earlier requested permission to submit a corrective statement. Ward granted it. I accepted summary language without demanding source crosswalk, the director said. That will not recur under my review authority. It was not absolution, but it was recorded accountability. At 041, disbursement operations joined by secure line. A supervisor read the payment schedule into the record. Base retroactive amount, medical adjustment, statutory penalties, release timing, and direct deposit confirmation. First transfer executes at 9 a.m., she said. Remaining tranches follow standard Treasury cadence. She asked for my verification phrase. I gave it. For years, money had been treated as the only point of my appeal, as if dignity were a decorative argument layered over compensation. Hearing the numbers mattered, but what steadied me was the sentence before them. Operational authority affirmed. 5 days later, I returned to the same building at 9:15 under a pale winter sky and rain, fine as mist, on the plaza stone. This time my name was correct at check-in before I said a word. In Disbursement Suite 4, a program officer placed a formal packet in front of me on fresh federal letterhead. Every executive name above the signature block had changed from the version on my old denials. The corrective mandate had replaced the entire top line of authority tied to the compromised chain. I read each line slowly, not out of distrust now, but out of respect for the fact that text had finally stopped moving under me. Knox entered with a receipt from Central Vault confirming Exhibit A and Exhibit B storage locations, retention schedule, and access protocol. You asked for every item accounted for, she said. Now they are. Delaney arrived 10 minutes later, coat damp at the hem, and handed me certified copies of her 2 discrepancy notes with transmission stamps clear in blue ink. For your records, she said. No one can say they were never warned. We sat in procedural chairs under fluorescent light and signed final acknowledgement forms while a printer whirred in short intervals behind the counter. It was not cinematic. It was better. It was complete. Before I left, the compliance officer who had once blocked me at the rope approached with a thin amendment sheet. He had updated his recess log again, this time adding 1 line beneath the earlier correction. Claimant conduct throughout session. Disciplined, precise, cooperative, under pressure. He asked if I wanted a copy. Yes, I said. I placed it in my notebook beside the RI reference card and the corrected order. External contacts had answered, physical evidence had landed, stray gestures had resolved into testimony or notation. Nothing remained dangling in interpretation. Outside, the rain had stopped. Water still clung to the brass railings, and the plaza reflected the building in broken silver planes. I stood at the top step with the packet under my arm and felt, for the first time in 6 years, no need to rehearse an argument on the walk to my car. The record had already spoken in the only dialect that room respected. Source data, custody, signatures, consequences. My name is Quinn Mitchell, and the final fact was simple enough to carry without anger. Silence was never weakness in me. It was disciplined endurance, and when the system finally met the full record, it answered to my name instead of his signature.